Today we are jumping into our top 5 grief books. Always love a good recommendation.
We've got lots of books in front of us. There's about 12, 13 books.
So let's go. What do we got for number 1?
My number 1 grief book recommendation.
Welcome back everyone to another episode of Good Grief. I'm joined today by my husband Ryan.
How you going?
Good. And I'm Kaylee. If you don't know us yet, we're so glad you're here. Today we are jumping into our top 5 grief books. Like recommendations. Always love a good recommendation. Sometimes they're good. Sometimes you gotta let them go, but we're going to give you ours.
Because we've been asked by a lot of people.
Yes.
What book should we go to? Why? Can you save me the effort of reading them and being disappointed?
That's why you give a recommendation, right? Same with restaurants. Save me looking up, reading reviews, tell me where to go. After all, books are the backbone of like history, learning, stories, imagination, you name it. So
Our house has got a lot of books in it, but it's getting more and more filled with kids' books.
yeah,
And so
kids' books and grief books, they're both like stacking up.
Yeah,
so
pretty
like,
quickly.
Yeah, our lounge room is looking a little bit like a mini library. But good times. Babe, why do you like books so much?
I wasn't good at English in school, and so I didn't like to read and I didn't like to write. Those two things are completely flipped now, I think, because I realized what I could get out of books. Like I realized that like the result that I want could be on the other side of these pages. So I started reading on my own, like well after school, but probably 14 years ago is probably when I first started reading. It was before Dad died.
Okay.
It was personal development and that sort of thing.
Was that the flip?
That was the flip.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. How can I better myself? And then now, after like going through so much grief and loss, it's like, how can I better myself?
Yeah.
Because it's heavy.
What has someone else been through that I can get almost a little quick road to?
Yeah, I don't know if it's Tony Robbins who says, you can get a decade in a day. Like someone's decade that they've lived through, you can read through a book. Some books you can read in a day and you can get their whole 10 years of experience, lessons, etc., just in the space of a few pages. And I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. That's wild to think that that's what books can do for us. So that's what we're going to try and do for you today.
We're gonna do decades in 15 minutes. How
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, let's go.
Challenge
All
is on.
Challenge is on. Challenge accepted. Let's jump in. What's your number 5?
So we're gonna go in reverse order.
Yeah,
5
let's
to
go.
1.
Yep.
All right.
So that means you need to stay till the end so that you can find out what's number 1.
Big surprise.
Yeah.
Big reveal.
Dun, dun, dun.
All right.
Have you got it there for us?
We've got, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can see we've got lots of books in front of us. There's about 12, 13 books.
Yeah.
We haven't read all of the books that are out there on grief. There are a lot, but then there also aren't a lot, if you compare it to history or, whatever.
And we haven't finished all these books either.
No.
We've started a lot.
Some we haven't read. Some are partway through. Some we've read a couple of times, so that's sort of the basis that they're on. We've got a bunch here that we might mention as like special mentions as well through the episode. But let's start number 5.
Let's go. What do we got?
My number 5 book recommendation for going through grief is actually Finding Meaning by David Kessler, and it's co-written or co-authored by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who many people are well and truly aware of.
Yeah.
But I think in the title alone, Finding Meaning, it says what the book's about pretty clearly. And I love David Kessler and just his nature and the experience that he's been through with grief is so personal and intimate, and he's dedicated his whole life's work to then uncovering grief and how we can continue to find meaning. And I think that's an important part. And there are sort of 2 pieces that I want to point out in regards to this book that I think are sort of like the guiding forces or guiding light. One is that pain is inevitable. David says pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
Yeah, wow.
Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. We all go through pain.
We do.
If you're listening to this, you've experienced loss. But the suffering part, we can have a say in. And I think one of the guiding principles or questions that David talks about in here, that we talk about often, is instead of asking the question, why me? We flip that question to ask, what now? And that determines what direction we're going to go. That determines if we get stuck in the mud and we're just focused on self and the world is collapsing in around us, or if we ask the question, what now? It opens the door to possibility.
Wow, I think everyone can use that flip. I like that.
And so I think that what now leads to suffering being optional.
Yeah.
And if you're listening, everybody listening to this is going to be in a different stage of grief.
100%.
And I'm not referring to the 5 stages that people will talk about. We can talk about that as well. But you might be in early grief. You might have just lost someone yesterday. You might it might not be as recent like some of our grief, like our parents 11 years ago. So depending where you are, will be depending on what questions you're asking. Right now, you might be just saying, why me? Why me? But in time, you'll be able to ask the question, what now? And that projects forward into the future. What can we do? How can this serve us? How can it serve other people? How can we comfort others? That's what Finding Meaning is about by David Kessler.
So good. I think everyone will get to a stage in their grief where they're like, okay, how can I find meaning in this? And, what? Yeah.
And that's our hope, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, we're all going to inevitably go through grief at some stage. But what meaning can we get out of it? What good can we find in it? And yeah.
Totally.
So good. And also I saw your little notes in the front page there. Do you want to tell me, what your tactic is?
Yeah, totally. I found this off a dude on Instagram. Can't remember his name. Apologies, dude off Instagram.
Thanks, mate.
But
shout out to you.
Great little tip was, as you read books, because I get pen and mark books.
You get pen
everywhere.
to paper.
And there's like post-it notes and all sorts in my books so that I can flick to things quickly. But the purpose of writing in the front of the front cover is that you just note down the page and the sentence, or maybe it's just a word or the topic of that page, so that you can quickly reference the highlights or the bits in here that you found
the
most
good stuff.
helpful, the good stuff, at a glance, like I just have. And then you can just go straight to it. So when you pick up a book and somebody says, oh, like, what did you get out of it? And you have to sift through it to go, oh, this bit.
And you're like, oh, I know there was some good points, but...
You can just hand them the front cover.
Don't tell me where to find them.
Right.
Don't ask me where to find them.
So that's what you'll find in all my books.
That's why when I read books after Ryan, I can skim through to the underlined and look at the front cover.
You get the highlights.
So good. All right, David Kessler. Awesome. Number 4.
Number
what do
4.
We got?
This one's quite interesting because it arrived thanks to Amazon last week.
Yeah.
So haven't finished it.
No.
But I'm loving it. And so this is by J.S. Park. It's called As Long As You Need. And
you were reading this like yesterday morning, weren't you?
Yesterday morning. And I was weeping. We were
I was sleepy.
Yeah, we were up. We got woken up early. We had a chat at 5 something a.m. and then I thought, I can't get back to sleep.
Yeah.
I want to get up and maximize the day before we go to church. So I came out and read this, and I was sitting in our armchair and I was weeping over a story of a mother and her son and losing that son. So J.S. Park is a hospital chaplain, and he has, spent countless days and hours and weeks and months bedside with those who are sick and dying, and not only just with them, but their families as well. Some have recovered, most have died, and so consoling those families. And what I love most about what I've read so far is that JS is one of the most humble chaplains, authors, experts, if you quote unquote, that I've read, to say that he doesn't get it right all the time, and he definitely didn't get it right in his early days as a chaplain. And so he writes from such a...
he doesn't get grief right with other people or dealing with people's grief.
Yeah, he hasn't dealt with things right. And he exposes his own, mistakes and...
I still feel like that.
And wrongs. And I think that's beautiful because I think there's a culture potentially that's rising, where especially in grief, but in other areas of life as well, where you can't say the wrong words. You know, you have to say the right words. But if you've never been through something or helped somebody through something, how can you get that right?
Yeah.
And I don't think there is a right. And so I think that's what JS illustrates beautifully in his book. So this one's amazing. And I think the other thing about this is hearing other people's stories of loss, not to compare losses, but it almost puts me in my place of knowing that I'm not alone, and also that people go through hell, and it sometimes can pull you up a little bit to know that, wow, I have pity on them and empathy for them because of what they've gone through, despite the pain that I'm going through myself. And I think that's a beautiful thing that he illustrates here. And he's also just very poetic in the way that he writes, but also raw. And so I think everyone can relate to J.S. Park. Follow on Instagram as well. Follow him on Instagram because he's got incredible stuff there too.
So
That's
good.
my number 4.
I'm going to be picking that up soon, I think. Feeding and reading.
Feeding and reading. So good.
I got all these new things with babies. Coffee and cuddles. Feeding and reading. All right, let's go. Number 3.
Number 3. This is a personal favorite, and
I know that face.
comes from a good friend of ours, David Schaefer. The book's called Grieve Upwards, One Man's Journey Through the Valley. David is like no one else that I've ever met. He first lost his wife to cancer, and then his daughter.
Yep.
And then he remarried and lost his second wife, who I had the pleasure of meeting as well. He's also lost his father. And so Dave knows a thing or two from his own experiences about grief, and also that there is still ways of maintaining hope through that grief. David's a Christian, and he writes this book from a faith perspective, but doesn't hold back from his feelings towards God and the questions that he had towards God as well, as you can imagine. But we had him on.
Needed.
We had him on the podcast.
Yeah, we did.
Episode 15. If you would like to listen into David's podcast with us, it's insightful, it's inspiring, it's raw and real, and it's also practical as well. A couple of the things that I love.
Whoa, that page is almost full.
Yes, my front cover is full of this because I have read this once or twice. Is that there are a couple of things in here I'll just pull out. Grieving people love to laugh, and that was one of the lessons that we've
just recently.
We told jokes on the show last week because we know how much we need and love to laugh. That we should happen to grief instead of grief happening to us. I think that was a perspective shift, that we can actually take steps towards grief rather than just being affected by it. And also that we're all dying. That was a good one as well. Just
That's true.
Some very simple thoughts that remind us of our mortality and what we've signed up for. So that's my number 3. You can pick that up on Amazon as well. Grieve Upwards.
Grieve Upwards. Thanks, Dave. All right. Number 4.
Or number 2.
Oh my gosh, I'm going backwards.
That's baby brain.
Baby brain. For anyone that doesn't know, we've got an almost 8-week-old.
Which I can hear in the background.
Hello. She was meant to be asleep, but she woke up right before we started, so we're making do.
Number 2.
So number 2.
We're getting close to the top.
What do we got?
My second most recommended grief book is A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. What I love about this book is it's tiny.
I was going to say, that's a power pocket.
Yep. If you're watching, you probably can't even see it when I turn it sideways because it's so thin. This book is the first grief book I read after Dad died 11 years ago. I can remember clearly going over to New Zealand on tour with our band. I had this book in hand, and I remember reading in the hotel, the little motel that we had there, and it really spoke to me because I had no reference point, no compass for grief. And C.S. Lewis, I had no idea, even though I loved his books and his movies, I had no idea that he'd lost his wife early on into their marriage, very early on. And so he writes this book as a series of journal entries that he had written in the depth of his grief and published it as a book. One of the key things that framed the way that I looked at grief from that very moment 11 years ago was C.S. Lewis' revelation that he was wishing his wife to come back to life.
I remember when you telling me that.
Until God revealed to him that how cruel that wish is for her to come down from heaven and glory back to earth, only to die and go through death a second time.
Yeah.
And that changed my perspective completely. So I won't share any more than that. This book is incredible, A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis.
So good. You can get that on Amazon too, I'm guessing.
I'm sure.
Yep. Find it at a store near you. What do we got for number one?
Number one grief book recommendation. I want to break this down by saying that just recently I was recommended by our pastors a podcast by Jensen Franklin. And the podcast is called Wounds That Glow in the Dark, if you want to note that down and listen to it. Best podcast I've heard recently on grief. And Jensen Franklin talks about a man named Victor Hugo in the 1800s. I had no idea who Victor Hugo was, but I think many people will know his movies or writings. He is known for The Hunchback of Notre Dame and also Les Mis as well.
I loved that Hunchback Notre Dame when I was a kid.
Yeah.
So good.
And so Victor Hugo's story is that he wrote hundreds, if not thousands of books, and was so regarded by the people of France that they were going to rename Paris after him. They were going to rename Paris Hugo when he died. So that's how important his literature and his books were and his writings. Victor Hugo was asked what his favorite or all-time book was, and I thought this was fascinating. And his response was this: tomorrow, if all literature was to be destroyed and it was left to me to retain one work only, I should save Job.
Wow.
And he's referring to the book of Job in the Bible.
Okay.
And I agree with Victor Hugo, and I haven't written hundreds or thousands of books, but
You've recently reread Job.
I've read Job so many times. I've got scripture from Job tattooed on me.
Right.
Because everyone, and Victor says this, everyone at some point in their life will find themselves in the book of Job. And I think Job is so relatable for so many different reasons. Obviously, if you've read the book of Job, he loses everything. Workers, staff, friends, his family, of course, his children, all of his children, his livestock, his business, his reputation. There's so much loss in there. And we can relate to Job. He says in Job 6, Job replies and says, "If only my anguish could be weighed and all my misery placed on the scales, it would surely outweigh the sand of the seas."
Ooh, that's a picture.
So Job knows what pain, loss and grief is and what it is to mourn. And so we can relate to Job. We can also relate to Job in the way that his friends try and comfort him and get it wildly wrong.
They get it wrong.
They get it wildly wrong. And so we can relate to that. But then if we fast forward to the end of Job, we can see how the story ends. And I think this is a testament to his faithfulness and what we have in store when we put our hope in Christ as well. It says, after Job had prayed for his friends and the Lord had made him prosperous again and gave him twice as much as he had before, all his brothers and sisters and everyone who'd known him came before him and met with him at his house. And it goes on to say that the Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the first. And you just think he was blessed in the first part of his life and lost everything. It goes on to say he had 14,000 sheep and 6,000 camels, so everything was doubled, and he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And it says his daughters, there was nowhere in the land that there were women as beautiful as his daughters. So he was really blessed. And it goes on to say Job lived 140 years, and he saw his children and their children to the 4th generation.
Wow.
So you talk about a turnaround from a disaster. Job is the perfect story. And so that's why it's my number one grief book recommendation, because like Victor Hugo said, we will all find ourselves somewhere in the book of Job in our lifetime.
Wow. Thank you. That was awesome.
That's my top 5.
That is your top 5. You've been through many books, and thank you for bringing us the 5 today. That hopefully our listeners, hopefully you can share one of these with someone as well.
Or jump on Amazon and just order one of them books, and they'll be at your door.
Yep.
Within 24 hours if you got Prime.
Yep. Order one, send it to someone else. Help someone out this week. Send them a surprise gift. Thanks for listening. Hope you got something out of it. I definitely did. I'm going to jump in to that new book.
Yeah. Get the tissue box ready, trust me.
Feeding and Reading. Oh, gosh. I'll be crying on the first page. All right. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Love you lots.
We'll speak soon.
Bye.
Bye for now.